How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. My plan was to turn this figure model into a scary animatronic bear, but the proportions were just a little too big, which required me to sculpt my own from scratch. The bear I'm making today is a character from the game Five Nights at Freddy's. It's the Freddy from the game's title. There's a movie coming out about it, and while it doesn't necessarily look like something that I will enjoy watching, I did play the original game with my brothers, and I enjoyed the jump scares. That being said, it's quite scary and definitely not something I'd recommend for kids. I tried to make this diorama nice and lighthearted, but just as a warning to parents, it is based off something pretty spooky. I sculpted Freddy from Super Sculpey, which I'm pretty out of practice with, but it was fun nonetheless. I used a heat gun to cure some of the small pieces partially, and then I glued them together. This kept me from ruining all of my previous progress as I progressed through the sculpt. I gave Freddy his signature little top hat, a nice rotund belly, some arms, a bow tie, and some legs before curing him fully, and then cleaning up the clay off of my hobby mat. While I was in Korea last month, I found this awesome model kit of the original Academy model store. It even comes with these tiny model vehicles. So there's models within a model. It's very meta. While coming up with a project for this week, I thought, what if this model store had gone out of business ages before and a life-size Freddy Fazbear model kit was still on display in the window? It's very random, I know, but sometimes the most fun ideas are the most random ones. Once all the pieces were removed from their sprues, I began assembly, starting with the lettering on the sign. I've never put together a model kit quite like this one, so when I saw it at a hobby store in Seoul, I knew I needed to make room in my luggage for it. I've built a few model kits from Academy over the years, but this one is definitely the most unique. After the sign, I assembled the base. It came with a bunch of display shelves for all those little model kits to sit on, but this store is going to be old and out of use, so I'm going to break some of these shelves later on. But I wanted to get the whole thing together and just see how it would fit, and also how I needed to break everything apart for painting. I added the little grate in the gutter in its place, as well as an air conditioning unit above the door. Then I dabbed on some Tamiya putty onto all the concrete areas, which doesn't show up right here because it's all white, but definitely adds a nice texture that will catch the paint later on. Once the putty had dried, I disassembled the kit and I took it outside to prime. To maintain chaos, thematically, I decided to also add a Ford Pinto to this diorama. I realized recently that I'm not one for all of the finicky detail work involved in building model car engines. And by recently, I mean since the first time I ever built a model car, which was back in 2001. My first model car was actually another Ford. It was a '69 Mustang GT, and it was a disaster. I used super glue instead of plastic cement because the plastic cement was taking too long, and then I glued my fingers together, broke all of the pieces of the engine, put them in the wrong places, and I just hid the whole mess of an engine inside the hood, which I sealed shut so no one would ever see it. And then I touched the glossy spray paint before it was dry, ruining that. And finally, that super glue that I had used to put the car together clouded up the windows. And I learned a very valuable lesson that day, and that lesson was, don't buy Ford. For the people on this diorama, I went with the sequel to Campus Friends, which was a direct-to-video release. I chose this one because it was 1:24 scale, which is the same as the model shop in the car, and the characters would also fit in this context. It came with 5 figures, one of which I will not be using in this diorama, as well as a little moped that I'm looking forward to kit bashing into something else at a later time. The figures were made in such a way that the gaps between the different pieces were very well hidden and blended together almost seamlessly, making them very fun and quite satisfying to put together. One of the girls has her phone out and is taking a selfie, which I felt lent itself very nicely to some fun storytelling for this diorama. After all 4 characters had been put together, I took everything outside and I primed it. The sign above the door just got a matte clear coat to preserve the original colors but also hold some washes. Everything else got primed with a base coat of paint. The first thing to work on was the sign, which I saturated in a nice dark brown wash. I used isopropyl alcohol to get it to run into all the cracks, as well as loosen it up from all the raised surfaces, which I wiped away with a paper towel. I painted the little red Academy logo in the corner with a brush, and then I repeated the same weathering process with the rest of the building. Which probably means I could have just glued them together and then done the weathering to save me some time. Once all the initial weathering had been applied, I glued the sign to the building, and then I began working on the interior. I put all the glass shelves in place, and like I said earlier, I wanted the inside to look old and abandoned. So I cracked a few of the glass pieces into little shards, and I scattered the glass shards around the inside on the floor. I then added a layer of dust that would have accumulated over many years of neglect. I threw the exterior on for a minute and made sure that got some dust as well. After that, it was time to add the acrylic windows. I used plastic cement instead of super glue because, well, actually leave a comment if you remember why you're not supposed to use super glue on acrylic. I made sure to break at least one pane of glass, and after putting both halves of the broken pane into the frame, I put the door in place, which I had been giving all of the same weathering treatment off camera. After that, I used the airbrush to throw some dusty dirt against the inside and outside of the windows, and then I wiped away most of it with more isopropyl alcohol and a paper towel. This left me with a nice old, dusty, smeared window look. I painted up a few of those tiny model kits and put them randomly on the shelves. I was going to add more, but I decided it would be fun to save a few for future dioramas made in some tiny, tiny scales. Let me know if you have any suggestions in the comments for how I should use these. After the building was mostly done, I broke out the airbrush again, and I began painting the Pinto, and as you can see, the paint job is quite complicated. While that first layer of paint on the Pinto was drying, I moved over to the teddy bear. I've heard that painting clay with regular spray paint leads to tackiness, so I went with acrylics, which ended up giving me a much more refined look. Once Fredbear was base coated, I went into detail with the brush. Painting this little bear brought back memories of my time watching the Country Bear Jamboree at Disney World, and I can't think of anything more uncomfortable than making extended eye contact with one of those bears. Other than maybe making extended eye contact with Chuck E. Cheese. Before painting the bear, I had taken the Pinto outside and given it some glossy clear coats, which gave it that nice, glossy car paint look. When that was dry, it was time to assemble. Given that one of the girls in this diorama is taking a selfie on a smartphone, I'm not sure what time period this is supposed to be. The Pinto was replaced by the Ford Escort in 1980, and come to think of it, I don't know if any of them were ever shipped to Korea. So the whole timeline and reality is a mystery in this one. I painted up the figures with the same clothing colors that I saw on the box. After giving them a zenithal highlight, I painted them with contrast paints, which did most of the heavy lifting. Then I did some highlights. It gave me a very nice result with very low effort. I went back and I painted the non-concrete section of the building, which I had overlooked doing earlier, and then it was time to season the ground. I added a brown wash to the gutter and I lined it with some white glue. I sprinkled on some blended turf flocking and blew it into the glue in hopes that it would just stick in that area. I then dripped some gloss varnish into the gutter as well to make it look a little bit wet. At this point, most of the painting and weathering was done, so it was time to add some lights. I pulled the cover off the back and I broke out one of my favorite things to use in dioramas, and that's these LED filaments. I made a little light mount from pieces of balsa wood, and I anchored some eye hooks into the wood on either side to hold the filament. The filament is coated in silicone, so you can't glue it to stuff. After threading the filament through both of those eye hooks, I added some solder to either end, and I connected them to some wires. While soldering the negative wire, I actually burnt my thumb just there. I found the spot on the back where I wanted the switch to go, marked it, and then I drilled a hole for it. I used my X-Acto knife to get the exact size hole that I wanted. Once the switch was in place, I wired it up to the battery pack and then wired everything up to the filament. And it's always good to test your circuit before you glue anything in place. The circuit was working fine, so I glued the light in place with some super glue. And you may be wondering, Why did I use super glue near the acrylic? But this is the super expensive foam safe super glue, so it doesn't cause the same cloudiness that the normal stuff does. After gluing Freddy into his position, I put the shop on and I painted the top and the side of the shop with matte black. The last thing to do was to put the Pinto and all the campus friends into their positions. As you can see, the two girls by the car are getting a selfie with the giant goofy looking bear that's hiding in the window. Once everything was glued in place, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.